Snow descended upon the Christmas fair with a gentleness that felt almost mocking, settling on garlands, rooftops, and the shoulders of revelers who believed the season itself conspired to keep them warm. Lanterns glowed in orderly rows, their amber light trembling against the dark, while a brass ensemble labored through a carol polished smooth by repetition. Laughter rang, vendors shouted cheer they did not feel, and the air smelled of roasted chestnuts and damp wool. It was a scene constructed for comfort, for reassurance, for the lie that winter could be kind. At the margin of that brightness, where music thinned and boots sank deeper into slush, a woman collapsed. She fell without spectacle. There was no cry to arrest attention, no dramatic clutch at a passerby's sleeve. One moment she stood, rigid with effort, breath shallow beneath a threadbare cloak, and the next she lay upon the frozen ground, her bonnet skidding aside, dark hair loosening from its pins. Snow gathered quickly at her lashes. Her gloved hand twitched once, then stilled. People noticed. They always noticed. Yet noticing was not the same as helping. A pair of matrons paused, faces pinched with curiosity rather than concern. A gentleman stepped aside to avoid her skirts, muttering irritation at the obstruction. Someone laughed too loudly, eager to separate himself from the discomfort of witnessing another's distress. Whispers formed, light as frost and just as biting. "Fainted," one voice guessed, unimpressed. "Drink," another supplied. "Or worse," concluded a third, with satisfaction. Respectability, in that age, was a garment easily stained and rarely cleaned. A woman without visible escort, without a household name to defend her, was already suspect. Unconsciousness merely confirmed what society preferred to believe. She lay there longer than was decent. When at last a man stopped, it was not with haste. He regarded the scene with a stillness that suggested thought rather than shock, as though weighing not only the woman at his feet but the world that permitted her to remain there. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark coat cut with quiet authority, boots polished despite the snow. The Duke of Ashford had learned early that command did not require volume. He removed his gloves. That small, deliberate act carried weight. A gentleman did not touch uncertainty. He did not involve himself in the untidy consequences of another's misfortune. And yet the Duke knelt, heedless of the slush soaking his knee, and placed 2 fingers gently at the woman's throat. She lived. Her pulse fluttered, weak but insistent, as though clinging to the world by habit alone. Her skin was cold. Too cold. He shrugged out of his coat without ceremony and settled it around her shoulders, shielding her from the snow and from the eyes that had grown sharper with interest. "Is she yours?" someone asked, not kindly. "No," the Duke replied, rising to his full height. "She is unwell." The correction was precise, and it ended the speculation. He bent again, slipping one arm beneath her shoulders, another beneath her knees, lifting her with practiced care. She weighed little, alarmingly little, and her head fell briefly against his chest. For an instant, he felt her breath, uneven and fragile, warm against the cold wool of his waistcoat. A murmur rippled through the fair. He carried her toward his waiting carriage, ignoring the way conversations twisted behind him, ignoring the curiosity that sharpened into something more dangerous. As he adjusted his grip, her fingers stirred, curling weakly into the fabric of his coat as though instinct had chosen him without consent. Her lips moved. At first he thought it no more than breath escaping. Then he leaned closer, compelled by a sound so faint it might have been imagined. "Please," she whispered, the word frayed at its edges. Or perhaps it was a name. Or a warning he did not yet understand. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing a startling gray, lucid for a single heartbeat, and in that fleeting instant he saw not gratitude, but fear sharpened by long endurance. Then the moment passed. Her grip loosened, and she slipped back into darkness. Inside the carriage, warmth crept slowly from the footwell, scented with leather and old paper. The woman did not stir. Her face, now free of snow, bore the marks of careful restraint rather than excess. No rouge, no jewelry save a thin chain at her throat, its pendant hidden. The Duke noted the calloused fingers, the mended cuffs, signs of effort that unsettled him more than any display of drama. He ordered the driver onward, knowing caution would not prevent talk. By morning, the fair would have sharpened its story. He weighed the consequences with practiced calm, yet beneath it stirred unease, not of gossip, but of having underestimated her need. She shivered, and he adjusted the coat, withdrawing quickly from the intimacy. Her eyes, briefly lucid and resigned, would not leave him. At a discreet lodging, he carried her inside without announcement. The staff asked nothing. As he surrendered her to their care, a heavy certainty settled upon him. He had crossed an invisible line, not of propriety, but of attention, and attention once given could not be reclaimed. The carriage door closed with a decisive thud, sealing her away from the fair's false warmth. As the horses lurched forward, the Duke allowed himself one unguarded breath, uncertain whether he had just intervened in a misfortune or invited one into his life. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing footprints, preserving whispers, and marking the beginning of a scandal that would not fade so easily. She woke to warmth that felt borrowed, the kind that never fully convinced the body it was safe. Firelight trembled across unfamiliar walls, and for a suspended moment she did not know where she was, only that her limbs ached with exhaustion and her mouth tasted faintly of iron. When she shifted, the bed creaked softly beneath her, too solid, too well made to belong to any place she might claim as her own. Panic rose, swift and practiced, until she forced herself to breathe slowly, counting each inhale as though it were a stitch holding her composure together. A maid appeared before fear could sharpen into flight. The woman's voice was careful, neither warm nor cold, as if trained to hover precisely between sympathy and suspicion. She explained where the heroine lay, how she had been brought there, how a physician had come and gone. No details were offered about the man who had intervened, yet his presence lingered everywhere. In the quality of the sheets, in the coal burning generously in the grate, in the assumption that recovery was not optional but expected. She listened without interruption, absorbing meaning from what was left unsaid. Kindness, she knew, rarely arrived without cost. When the maid left, she lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling, trying to summon indignation, gratitude, or relief. What came instead was dread, quiet and unyielding. Whatever life she had painstakingly arranged depended upon her being overlooked. Rescue, however noble, was a form of exposure. She did not see him that day, nor the next. Instead, tokens arrived. The first was a pair of gloves, delivered folded within plain paper. They were warm, well-stitched, and lined with silk so fine it slid like water against her skin. She turned them over in her hands, unsettled by how precisely they fit, as though chosen with knowledge rather than chance. There was no card, no crest, only the unspoken certainty of their origin. The second was a book. Poetry, bound in dark leather, its spine uncreased, its pages untouched. She opened it once, then closed it quickly, as if words themselves might demand more than she could afford to give. By the third offering, a modest bouquet of winter roses left upon the table without ceremony, she felt the ground shift beneath her careful footing. Gifts invited interpretation, and interpretation invited judgment. She imagined the whispers already forming, imagined how easily benevolence could be rewritten into patronage, how swiftly concern might curdle into speculation. A woman in receipt of attention was assumed to have earned it, by charm or by compromise. She rose as soon as the physician allowed, dressing with deliberate plainness, binding her hair neatly, restoring the armor of invisibility. When she stepped back into the street, the city regarded her differently. It was subtle, but she felt it in the pauses between glances, in the way shopkeepers' eyes lingered too long, in the half-finished conversations that stilled when she passed. She had been observed leaving respectable lodgings. That alone was enough. The rumor found its breath a week later. A carriage stopped at the corner as she approached, black and polished, its crest unmistakable even to those who pretended not to see such things. The Duke descended first, movements measured, expression composed. He did not touch her arm when he greeted her, yet the space between them closed in a way that made onlookers lean forward, hungry for detail. He spoke quietly, courteously, asking after her health as though it were the most natural thing in the world to do so in public. She answered with restraint, every word chosen to offend no one and reassure everyone, though she doubted it would matter. When he offered the carriage, she hesitated only a fraction of a second too long. That hesitation, slight as it was, sealed her fate. Declining would have drawn attention. Accepting would confirm suspicion. She stepped inside, and the door closed with a sound that echoed louder than it should have. By evening, London had decided who she was. She heard it in fragments, reflected through others' glances. A kept woman. A schemer. A poor creature with ambitions beyond her station. Each version stripped her of agency while pretending to explain her presence. The Duke's name lent weight to the story, and weight made it credible. No one asked whether kindness might exist without transaction. That notion lacked entertainment value. That night, she sat at the small desk in her room, the book before her, unopened. Her hands trembled only once before she steadied them. She tore a page from her own notebook, wrote carefully, then folded the note until the words were hidden from even herself. She returned the book the following morning. When the Duke received it, he dismissed the footman and stood alone by the window, the city spread beneath him in shades of iron and smoke. He read her message once, then again, noting not what it accused but what it feared. It was not reproach. It was retreat. He folded the paper with meticulous care and placed it inside his coat, as though preserving something fragile rather than rejecting it. Outside, carriages rattled on, and conversation carried on without him, but his attention had narrowed to a single inconvenient truth. Silence, he realized, had not protected her. It had merely allowed others to speak in his stead. As he turned from the window, decision settled over him with calm inevitability, and somewhere across the city, she paused mid-step, seized by the unshakable sense that the shelter she had tried to refuse was about to become impossible to escape. They met away from the places where reputations were traded like currency, in a narrow drawing-room borrowed from a distant relation who asked no questions and promised discretion as a matter of survival. The windows were curtained against the afternoon fog, and the fire burned low, as if even the flames had learned restraint. She stood when he entered, hands folded before her, posture composed to the point of fragility, every line of her bearing declaring that she expected neither comfort nor absolution. He did not bow deeply. He did not rush to speak. The Duke of Ashford closed the door behind him with quiet finality, then regarded her as one might regard a problem that demanded honesty rather than cleverness. Time stretched, thick with the weight of all that had been said about them, all that had not. The room smelled faintly of old books and coal smoke, domestic and anonymous, lending the meeting an intimacy that unsettled them both. "I regret that my silence has caused you distress," he said at last, his voice even, his tone devoid of defense. "That was not my intention." She inclined her head, a gesture so precise it bordered on brittle. "Intentions are a luxury," she replied. "Outcomes are what remain." The words surprised him. He studied her more closely then, noting the careful plainness of her gown, the way its fabric bore the marks of repeated mending rather than neglect. Nothing about her suggested indulgence. Everything suggested endurance. "You wish to speak," she continued, before he could respond. "I am here." He gestured toward a chair, but she did not sit. Standing, she could leave more easily. He respected that choice and remained where he was, a measured distance between them that acknowledged both courtesy and caution. "I wish to understand," he said. "Not the rumors. You." A flicker crossed her face, too swift to be hope, too sharp to be fear alone. She turned slightly, angling her body away from him as though bracing herself against a familiar blow. "Understanding invites obligation," she said quietly. "I have learned to avoid both." He did not contradict her. Instead, he waited, allowing silence to do what it often did best, which was to make room for truth. When she spoke again, her voice had steadied, as though she had chosen resolve over relief. "My name is not the one you were given," she said. "It has not been for many years." He absorbed this without visible reaction, though something in his gaze sharpened. She continued, each word measured, stripped of drama, as if telling a story she had rehearsed too often to feel its edges anymore. "I was born to a family that no longer exists in polite memory. My father's errors were public, his debts unforgivable. When he fell, he took us with him, and society was grateful for the simplicity of forgetting us altogether. I learned early that survival required disappearance." She paused, fingers tightening briefly before she forced them still. "I changed my name." I changed my circumstances. I did nothing illegal, nothing immoral. But I learned how thin the line is between being invisible and being suspect. The fire shifted, sending a soft crack through the room. He did not interrupt. She had earned the dignity of being heard without haste. When I collapsed at the fair, she said, and here her voice wavered despite her efforts, it was not illness alone. It was exhaustion. I have spent years ensuring I take up as little space as possible. That night, I miscalculated. She lifted her eyes to his then, and he saw the full weight of what she carried there, not shame exactly, but vigilance sharpened into instinct. Your kindness disturbed that balance, she said. It drew light to a place I have worked very hard to keep in shadow. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he stepped closer, not enough to crowd her, but enough to make retreat impossible without intention. You speak as though obscurity were a moral duty, he said gently. It is a necessity, she replied. Or it was. Until you intervened. He considered her words, not as an accusation, but as a reckoning. Do you regret that I did? He asked. Her answer came without hesitation. No, she said. I regret that I needed it. Something shifted then, subtle but irrevocable. He inclined his head, acknowledging not victory, but respect. Madam, he said, and the formality carried weight rather than distance. You mistake my actions if you believe them born of pity. I saw a woman treated as disposable. I acted because I would not be complicit in that judgment. Her breath caught, audible in the small room. She turned away, pressing her palm briefly to the back of a chair, steadying herself against words she had not expected to hear. You do not know the cost, she said. Association with me will not end in whispers. It will end in consequence. I am not unfamiliar with consequence, he replied. Nor am I unacquainted with choosing despite it. She faced him again, and for the first time, her composure cracked. Why? She demanded, the question stripped bare. Why persist when silence would be safer for us both? He held her gaze, and in it there was no romance, no promise, only conviction honed by years of responsibility. Because safety, he said, is a poor substitute for justice. Footsteps sounded faintly beyond the door then, the murmur of voices passing too near. She stiffened instantly, the reflex of concealment returning with practiced speed. The world was intruding again, impatient with private truths. If we are discovered, she said urgently, this conversation will become another story told without my consent. He moved toward the door, listening until the danger passed, then turned back to her. In that brief interval, something unspoken settled between them, fragile and charged. This is not finished, he said quietly. Nor should it be. She nodded once, accepting not reassurance, but inevitability, and as she gathered her shawl to leave, she realized with a sudden, disorienting clarity that the truth she had guarded so carefully no longer belonged solely to her, and that knowledge, once shared, could never be safely returned to silence. The evening announced itself long before the guests arrived, as though the house itself braced for consequence. Light spilled from every window of the Ashford ballroom, scattering across the frost-laced gardens and turning bare branches into delicate filigree. Inside, chandeliers blazed with calculated brilliance, each crystal cut to fracture light into elegance. The orchestra tuned with restrained impatience. Servants moved like shadows trained to anticipate desire before it formed. This was not merely a gathering, it was a declaration of continuity, of rank reaffirmed through ritual. She entered late. Not by intention, but by hesitation, that familiar pause born of knowing precisely what waited beyond the threshold. Her gown was simple, chosen for dignity rather than admiration, its muted hue a quiet refusal to compete. She felt every glance as she crossed the floor, felt the instant recalibration of curiosity sharpened by recognition. Whispers did not yet rise. They hovered, coiled and expectant. She kept her shoulders square, her expression composed, reminding herself that retreat would only confirm what they wished to believe. The Duke stood near the center of the room, engaged in conversation that did not reach his eyes. He sensed her before he saw her, a shift in the room's attention rippling outward. When he turned, his gaze settled on her with unmistakable intent. There was no surprise there, no question. Only decision. The space between them seemed to narrow of its own accord. Guests tracked his movement as he excused himself with polite finality and crossed the floor. Each step was unhurried, deliberate enough to invite notice. By the time he reached her, the orchestra had begun, the opening notes of a waltz threading through the room like a challenge. He inclined his head. "May I," he said, extending his hand, "have this dance?" The question was formal. The choice was not. A murmur rippled outward, restrained but unmistakable. She looked at his hand, aware of how much rested upon that small, offered gesture. Accepting would confirm every rumor. Refusing would abandon him to their interpretation. She placed her gloved fingers in his palm, feeling the steadiness there, and allowed herself to be drawn into the pattern of the dance. They moved with practiced ease, bodies aligned without intimacy, the distance between them precise. He did not speak at first. Neither did she. The music carried them, and with it, the eyes of the room. She felt exposed, not in the sense of vulnerability, but of being rendered visible in a way she had never permitted herself before. "You need not endure this," she murmured when at last he leaned closer, his voice pitched for her alone. "I would understand if you stepped away." "I have stepped away all my life," he replied quietly. "I find it no longer suits me." The simplicity of the admission struck deeper than any declaration. She faltered, just briefly, and he adjusted without comment, guiding her back into rhythm. Around them, conversation had thinned to speculation disguised as civility. This was not how such evenings unfolded. This was not how lines were preserved. As the music swelled, he drew her nearer, still proper, still restrained, yet unmistakably allied. When the final notes faded, he did not release her immediately. Instead, he turned them together toward the watching assembly, his hand resting lightly at her back, a gesture small enough to be deniable, bold enough to be read. "I believe," he said, his voice carrying with measured clarity, "that my guest requires no further introduction." Silence fell, sharp and sudden. He did not offer explanation. He did not defend her origins or obscure her history. He stood, quite simply, beside her. The implication was unmistakable. She was not hidden. She was chosen. A woman nearby inhaled sharply. Somewhere else, a laugh died unfinished. The moment held, trembling with the weight of what had been breached. She felt a surge of emotion she did not immediately recognize, until she understood it was relief edged with terror. To be claimed in such a manner was to relinquish control. To accept it was to trust. "You are doing this deliberately," she said under her breath. "Yes," he answered. "And publicly." The dance floor shifted as couples rearranged themselves, some drawn closer, others edging away, alliances recalculating in real time. She saw it all as though through glass, aware that something fundamental had changed. The careful anonymity she had constructed had been dismantled in a single, elegant gesture. As the evening progressed, he did not leave her side. He spoke to her with ease, introduced her without qualification, accepted the tension as part of the cost. She answered questions with quiet grace, refusing both apology and explanation. Each exchange reinforced the same truth. She was no longer alone in the narrative being written about her. When at last he escorted her toward the edge of the room, away from the densest press, she exhaled for the first time since arriving. "You have set events in motion," she said. "They will not be easily undone." "I am not interested in undoing them," he replied. She searched his face, finding no hesitation there, only resolve sharpened by exposure. "And if what they uncover is worse than rumor?" she asked. "If my past proves more inconvenient than you imagine?" His expression softened, not with indulgence, but with certainty. "Then we will endure inconvenience," he said. "I have endured comfort long enough." The orchestra struck up again, but neither of them moved to rejoin the floor. They stood together, aware that eyes still lingered, that judgment had not dissipated, only shifted shape. She felt the old instinct to retreat rise within her, then recede, unsettled by the realization that retreat was no longer her only option. As he offered his arm to escort her out into the colder, quieter corridor beyond the ballroom, she hesitated, not from fear, but from the dawning understanding that what he had given her was not protection, but visibility. She accepted his arm, stepping into consequence with him, unaware that elsewhere in the house, a letter waited to be delivered, its seal already broken, its contents poised to test just how far his declaration would carry them both. Snow returned without ceremony, drifting over the city as if nothing had changed, as if choices had not been made and lines not crossed. By morning, the gardens of Ashford lay muted beneath white, every path softened, every boundary disguised. The household stirred with unusual quiet, servants moving carefully, aware that the air itself felt altered. She stood at the tall window of the withdrawing room, watching the flakes gather, her reflection faint in the glass, uncertain whether she was observing the world or waiting to be judged by it. The letter arrived just after dawn. It was placed upon a silver tray and carried in without comment, yet its presence altered the room at once. The Duke recognized the hand before he broke the seal, a tightness settling in his jaw that betrayed more than any outburst might have done. He read it standing, then read it again, slower, as though repetition might blunt its edge. When he looked up, she had turned from the window, instinctively attuned to the shift in him. "It has come," she said quietly. "Yes," he replied. He did not offer the letter at once. Instead, he met her gaze, granting her the respect of preparation. "It names you," he continued, "and it names me." She nodded, absorbing the inevitability. Fear did not surprise her. It had long been a companion. What startled her was the absence of shame. That had been spent already, wrung out by years of restraint. "May I see it?" she asked. He crossed the room and placed the paper in her hands. The words were precise, unembellished, devastating in their economy. Her former name, her father's fall, the calculated kindness of forgetting. The letter did not accuse, it exposed, and in doing so invited the world to decide her worth. She folded it carefully, returning it to him with a steadiness that felt earned. "So it ends," she said. "No," he answered at once. "So it clarifies." He spoke then of what would follow, the objections from his family, the quiet withdrawal of certain allies, the public curiosity sharpened into censure. He did not soften the truth, nor did he dramatize it. This was the cost of standing where he had chosen to stand. When he finished, she studied his face, searching for the limits of his resolve. "You owe me nothing," she said. "What you have already done exceeds obligation." "I am not acting from obligation," he replied, "nor from impulse. I am acting from alignment." The word lingered between them, deliberate and considered. Alignment suggested equality of purpose rather than rescue, choice rather than sacrifice. It unsettled her more deeply than any vow. Outside, the snow thickened, blurring the edges of the world. He offered his arm, not as command, but as invitation, and together they stepped into the cold. The path through the garden was unmarked, the air sharp enough to burn the lungs. Each breath felt like commitment, visible and undeniable. They walked without haste, aware that eyes watched from within, that the moment would not remain private for long. At the far end of the grounds, he stopped, turning to face her fully, the house behind him a looming testament to lineage and expectation. "This is the moment," he said, not unkindly. "Once we proceed, retreat will no longer be possible." She considered the snow at her feet, pristine and indifferent. For so long, she had lived as though retreat were the only wisdom, as though survival required perpetual contraction. Now, faced with the final invitation to disappear, she found the instinct dulled, overwritten by something quieter and stronger. "I have already retreated as far as I can," she said. "Anything else would be erasure." He smiled then, not with triumph, but with recognition. When he reached for her hand, she did not hesitate. The contact was simple, unadorned, and in that simplicity lay its power. They returned inside together. The confrontation that followed was not dramatic in the way stories often promise. It unfolded in measured conversations, in letters written and received, in doors that closed and others that opened with cautious curiosity. His family objected, as expected, their arguments framed in concern rather than cruelty. He listened, acknowledged, and refused to yield. Her history circulated, dissected by those who had never known her, yet found less purchase than anticipated. Exposure, once feared, lost some of its sting when met with steadiness. What surprised them both was how quickly the world adjusted. Scandal, it seemed, required resistance to sustain it. Without retreat, whispers tired of themselves. On a later evening, quieter and colder, they stood again at the edge of the gardens, snow falling as it had that first night, though now it gathered around them rather than upon them. The fair was a memory, its music long faded, but the echo of that moment remained, transformed. "I used to believe," she said, "that being seen was the greatest danger." "And now?" he asked. "And now I believe being unseen was the greater loss." He did not answer at once. He watched the snow, the way it erased footprints even as it marked presence. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm of a decision long made. "History will remember titles," he said. "But it is moments like this that endure." She leaned into him, not as refuge, but as equal, and together they watched the world settle into quiet. Somewhere beyond the walls, the city continued its restless judgment, but here, in the softened light, something had been resolved without fanfare. The snow remembered their stillness, and as it fell, it carried forward the promise that what began in collapse had ended in choice, and that choice, once claimed, would not easily be undone.